But let me review it a little bit for last night. For some of you who were not here last night, though I wish you had been, because last night I wanted to lay down a prophetic foundation for all I'm going to say this morning, on Wednesday night, next Friday night, and next Sabbath. Because I believe the wonderful thing about this great church is that it is based upon a fulfillment of prophecy like no other church in the world. Now that sounds arrogant, as I said last night, but I really believe it. And last night I tried to establish that to those of you who were here, that we laid down a strong prophetic foundation for the rise of the Adventist church. Now, is that very important? Is it important that we spend 6 meetings this week looking at history? Can I just remind you of these words that were written a long time ago, but by a historian? I showed it last night, but I want you to think about what it's saying. The first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Before long, that nation will forget what it is and what it was. Those are very true words, dear friends. And there have been people who have risen up in history as dictators who have determined to rewrite the history of their nation in order to establish a different nation. And what is true of nations, I really believe, dear friends, is also true of the church. If our church forgets why it exists, where it came from, why we live in the world today, we've got problems. And I see some of these problems already manifesting themselves. Because that historian was so right when he said that when you erase the memory of a nation or of a church, before long that nation or that church will forget what it is and what it was. And I want to add a little phrase to that, and what it is to be. Because, dear friends, the church's identity is very much like your identity. If I could wipe out your all memory that you have from birth to this point in time, think what it would do to your identity. You would cease to exist as a person. You wouldn't know why you're here, and you wouldn't know where you were going in the future, knowing nothing about your past. And I believe the same is true of the church. If we don't know why we came into existence 170 odd years ago, it's going to affect our view, not only our identity today, but also our mission for the future. Are we just another ism to add to all the other isms in the world today? Or do we have a special role? And that's what I would like to show you in the thrilling stories I'm going to share with you this week. These words, some of you will know and have read before. But again, I want you to notice what the author says. We have nothing to fear for the future. That's a big thing to say. In a world where men's hearts, to quote scripture, are failing them for fear as they look at the things that are coming on the earth, we have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history. True. Nothing to fear for the future? I hope that what I share with you this week, dear friends, is going to reinforce your faith and your confidence, not only in God's leading in the past, but with the challenges that our church and this world face today in 2016. And so this morning we have nothing to fear for the future, except that we forget our responsibility and the joy we can have in the hope of Jesus' soon return. Now, I'm going to put on the screen a little of the chart that I put on last night, just so that you can sort of catch up with me a little this morning, even though time is already against me. And this is the chart that we looked at last night. The book of Daniel tells us that the book of Daniel itself was to be closed up until the time of the end. And we contrasted two phrases, the end of time and the time of the end. The end of time is that time when Jesus is going to appear. That's the blessed hope. That's the climax, the end of the story. But the time of the end the Bible speaks about, and only Daniel mentions it, by the way, is a period of time before or preceding the second coming of Christ. Are we living in that time of the end today? We noticed last night, and I'm not going to give you any attempt to prove it, but you can come and see me sometime during the day or the week. because I'll show you this from Scripture. But the Bible makes it very plain that the time of the end would begin at the end of a prophetic time period identified in the book of Daniel, chapter 7:25, as a time, times and half a time. We discovered last night that the book of Revelation tells us exactly what period of literal time that period of time is. It's 1,260-day years, a day representing a year. We know also from the book of Daniel, and again you'll have to accept it from my word this morning, that that period of time began in the year 538 and ends in the year 1260 years later, 1798. Which means, dear friends, that from the scriptures, from the book of Daniel and Revelation particularly, the time of the end, that period of time leading up to the second coming of Jesus, began in 1798. And at that time, since we read last night in Daniel 12 verse 4, Daniel was told before he finished writing his book, seal up your book, close it up until the time of the end, which would suggest that when the time of the end comes, Daniel's book was to be opened as never before. Now, I'm not going to unpack that any further, but it's certainly that was what the Bible prophesied. Close up your book. In fact, I mentioned last night that of all the 66 books in the Bible, the only book of the 66 where the author was told, close your book up, seal it up until the time of the end, is the book of Daniel. Something special about that book, which means that when the time of the end came, the book of Daniel was particularly to be opened up and understood, and its message so relevant as never before in human history. Now, all I have put on the screen this morning so far is merely prophecy. That's what the Bible foretold, that there would be a time of 1,260 years in human history, particularly relating to the supremacy in world affairs of the Church of Rome. And if this prophecy is true, something should have happened to the Church of Rome in 1798 that brought its political prowess and rule over the nations to a temporary, did you notice what I said? To a temporary end. 1798, something should have happened at the end of that 1260 years. So I'm going to ask this morning, first of all, what happened in 1798? If this prophecy is correct, something should have happened that was a dramatic event in the life and the work and the history of the Church of Rome. Did it? Can I remind you this morning, dear friends, that right on time, a French general called General Berthier was sent by the French government down to the city of Rome, where Pope Pius VI was celebrating his 23rd anniversary to being elevated as the Pope. And on February 1798, General Berthier and his army broke into the Sistine Chapel. Now, you can probably just see on the screen that little building there wrapped around with pink. Here's big St. Peter's Basilica. What happened there in 1798 in February was a remarkable fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Now remember, what I had on the screen a moment ago was all prophecy. When we look at history and how marvellously history is a fulfillment of prophecy, we find that on that day in February 1798, General Berthier burst into the Sistine Chapel, and here's a better view of that little building, but what a history that building has. Every pope that's ever been elected in the recent 400 or 500 years have been elected in the Sistine Chapel. A remarkable building. And I'm going to take you inside to let you see what is inside that building and show you something very significant. If you go inside, you find that both the ceiling and the rear of the Sistine Chapel has been painted by that famous Italian artist Michelangelo. Scenes of biblical history right across the top. But what I found remarkable when I went into the Sistine Chapel some years ago, dear friends, was that among all the biblical scenes that are painted, you can see there on the ceiling, there is one that is of particular interest to us this morning. That one right there. Do you know what it is? Let me make it a little bit bigger for you. Michelangelo painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel the prophet Daniel. Daniel. And can I say this morning that Michelangelo could never have imagined in his wildest dreams, way back there in the 1500s, that in that building, underneath that picture, right below it in the Sistine Chapel, one of Daniel's major prophecies would be fulfilled. When the Pope was taken prisoner and was carried off to France, and Napoleon said, "No more popes will ever be elected." Napoleon was not a student of Bible prophecy, or he wouldn't have said that. Just a short time after visiting the Sistine Chapel, I was walking down the Vatican Museum. What a remarkable series of museums this is. But I was amazed to find over a doorway in the Vatican Museum a painting of the very time when Berthier was meeting the Pope, putting him in that carriage and taking him as a prisoner back to France, to Valence. Right there, portrayed in that very large painting in the Vatican Museum, is a fulfilment of Bible prophecy. 1798, exactly on time. And notice what the historian wrote about that event. The papacy was extinct. Not a vestige of its existence remained. And among all the Roman Catholic powers, not a finger was stirred in its defence. The eternal city had no longer prince or pontiff. Its bishop was a dying captive in foreign lands, and the decree was already announced that no successor would be allowed in his place. A very dramatic event, exactly 1260 years after the events of 538. What's this got to do with what I'm sharing with you this morning, dear friends? Something very important. Because when 1798 came, you'll remember that the book of Daniel, because it ushered in the time of the end, the book of Daniel was now to be opened as never before in human history. I'm going to put on the screen a chart that bears out exactly what I've said, and I want you to see it, first of all. Now, you won't see this chart at all in detail, but just stay with me and I'll show it to you in more detail in a moment. But there are two heavy vertical black lines on that chart. You might see them there, right there, and there. And there's a year on the top of that one and a year on the top of that one. Can you tell me what is the year you see on that chart on the left-hand line? What is it? 1798. On the one at the top, on the right, what year do you see? 1844. 1844. And across you see many horizontal lines. What's the significance of this chart? Let me put the top half on the screen where you can see it a little bit more clearly. Is this just dry history, my friends? No, it's not. Let me explain why. Because across those horizontal lines are the names of godly men, scholars of every religious persuasion, who, after 1798, began to write a book or a pamphlet or something to do with the book of Daniel. Now, I want you to and they show those pamphlets and books with little black dots you can see on those horizontal lines. Can you see any black dots to the left of 1798? Can you? No. Can you see any black dots between 1798 and 1844? Lots of them. And they go away with not so much regularity after 1844. If we go to the bottom half of that screen, you see one black dot right at the top on the left-hand side, but many black dots between 1798 and 1844. Dear friends, whether you realise it or not, what you are seeing on the screen is a remarkable fulfilment of prophecy. The book of Daniel was to be opened after 1798. And what caused it to be opened? They had studied the prophecy in Daniel 7 that I've referred to, where the Church of Rome would be in control for 1260 years. And when godly scholars in both Europe and in the United States began to look at those world events, looked at Daniel chapter 7 and said, why, we're seeing prophecy fulfilled, they only had to turn their Bibles over one page to Daniel 8, where they read the longest time prophecy in the whole of the Bible. I think most of you know it well. The prophecy in Daniel 8 of 2,300 years. 2,300 years. Let me go back to our chart to show you something. In the book of Daniel, we are told in Daniel 8 that there is one prophecy in the whole of the book that would reach into the time of the end. One prophecy, and that's this one. The one in Daniel 8:14, unto 2,300 years, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And without attempting this morning to prove it to you, may I remind you that that prophecy was fulfilled in that year, dear friends. And what I want you to notice is that the book of Daniel, the angel Gabriel, nobody lesser than angel Gabriel, was sent down to Daniel to explain that prophecy that would lead up to 1844. And can I ask you this morning very quickly and simply, is 1844 in the time of the end? Gabriel said 2,500 years ago that that prophecy would be fulfilled in the time of the end. After 1798. It was exactly as it was predicted. Let me just show you this. Concerning these distinguished expositors, these men who were printing all these books and pamphlets on the book of Daniel, now that 1798 had come and they'd seen the events in history, notice what the author says, Dr. Froome. Concerning these distinguished expositors, they were scattered over Europe, the British Isles, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Northern Africa, even India, not to mention Dr. Joseph Wolfe, who travelled all over Asia and Asia Minor and parts of Africa, as well as Europe and the United States. All of these men were proclaiming the same. The prophecy of 2,300 years is about to be fulfilled, and all agreed on the time at the end of that period. He goes on to say, these men were among the leading clergymen, theologians, educators, editors, college presidents, physicians, statesmen, barristers, military men of the time. They were of every religious persuasion, Anglican, Presbyterian, Congregational, Baptist, Lutheran, Reformed, Methodist, Christian, Disciple, and even including a Roman Catholic. And Dr. Froome goes on to say this, and this is what I want you to notice. This heralding of the approaching terminus, that is, the fulfilment, the end of the 2,300-year prophecy, reaching to the year, that crucial year of 1844, had a far wider, more numerous and noteworthy body of heralding expositors than any previous fulfilment of Bible prophecy, my friends. I want to remind us all this morning that when God does something that's laying down a foundation for final events in this world's history, he doesn't do it in a corner, in a secret. There's never been in the history of the last 2,000 years more people focusing on a Bible prophecy and its fulfilment than was happening in the early 1800s prior to 1844. He goes on to say, it was the most widespread prophetic message ever heralded to men up to that time. You know, I in talking to some of our people in various parts of the world, I've heard some people say, if they know anything about our history at all, looking back as to those early days, they say, well, yes, I seem to remember there was one man who was talking about the end of the world and Jesus coming back again in 1843, 44. And that's all they say. But I want to remind us all this morning, dear friends, God was laying a foundation. The book of Daniel had to be opened. The prophecy of the 2,300 years particularly had to be opened if you read Daniel 8. And that's exactly what had happened in history. God was laying down a foundation for the rise of a people who would take his last message to the world. What a responsibility. And that was the reason why this was so important. And who was the man? And this is the man that I just want to mention very quickly to you this morning. William Miller, an interesting character, a Baptist, a layman. His wife, Lucy. These portraits hang in the little chapel in one of our Adventist colleges in the United States of America, Atlantic Union College. Where was William Miller born and where did he live? These are the states on the northern right-hand corner, top right-hand corner of the United States of America. New York State is there, and in yellow I have tried to circle Lowhampton in the state of New York, because it was in Lowhampton, New York, that William Miller, as a young man, built this home that still stands there today for you to visit. Out the front is an interesting sign, the William Miller Home, the birthplace of Adventism in America. Why does it have that interesting title in this house? If I can just tell very briefly, William Miller was brought up in a Christian home, but soon after his marriage, he moved away from the home, the family home, moved over to Vermont, the next adjacent state, to a little town called Pulteney. And there he came into contact with men who were deists. I assume this morning that everyone in my hearing is a theist. What's the difference between a deist and a theist? A deist is somebody who believes in God, because the Latin word for God is Deus, deist. But it's a very different kind of God. A deist is somebody who believes that God created the world, placed it under law, and then withdrew to the end of the universe, having no more interest in the affairs of what happened on planet Earth. So if you're a deist, there's no such thing as a Bible, because why would God write a book to send to the people on a little planet we had no more interest in it? If you're a deist, you don't believe in prayer, because this God is so far away, he doesn't hear your prayers. There's no such thing as a saviour in deism, because why would this God come and personally visit this little planet Earth? A deist was a very depressing religion, but William Miller became a deist. And then through a remarkable series of events I don't have time to tell you this morning, he gave his heart back to Jesus in the around about 1814 or 15. And this is what he says. I was constrained to admit that the scriptures must be a revelation from God. Remember, he's writing as a deist once upon a time. They couldn't be a revelation from a God in a deism. But now that he'd become a theist, which is all that we are, I presume, somebody who believes in a personal God, who personally loves us, each one individually, who has visited this world and is soon to come again. That's a theist. They became, referring to the scriptures, my delight, and in Jesus I found a friend. The scriptures, which before were dark and contradictory, now became the lamp to my feet and the light to my path. The Bible now became my chief study, and I can truly say I searched it with great delight. I found the half was never told me. If I can put a little map on the screen, because if you visit the William Miller house today, you'll see the location of his home, and right at the top left-hand corner, the little chapel he built. There's the Ascension Rock. Have a look at that underneath the chapel, and the William Miller Cemetery. A little later on, after I had visited his home, I visited the cemetery where William Miller is buried. I was reminded that Ellen White says something about William Miller that she doesn't say about probably any other person that I know of. Because she says in the little book, Early Writings, that angels watch over the dust of William Miller, and in the first resurrection he shall come forth. Interesting, in the light of this man and what he did. And as I looked at his grave, I saw that open book at the top, because that's his grave in the centre of the picture. I was interested that on the top left-hand corner is Daniel 8:14. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. If you visit William Miller's home today, it's been restored just as it was in William Miller's day. It was there in his bedroom, in his study on the bottom left-hand corner, that we are told that angels visited William Miller in his study in the book Early Writings, and opened up to him the prophecies of the Scriptures. Right there in that home. William Miller had an interesting experience in searching for God. He spent 2 years studying the Scriptures. And during those 2 years, he came to a number of significant conclusions. But one of them was this, that after studying the book of Daniel, chapter 8, he came to the convicting conclusion that the end of the 2,300 years would mean the second coming of Jesus. Now, I know, dear friends, that we can sit here this morning and say, well, how come he came to a conclusion that was so wrong? But God was leading Miller as he was able to be led, just the same as he's led all the great reformers. Martin Luther didn't have all the truth. Neither did John Knox or John Wesley. They were men who faithfully responded to God's leading as God's Spirit was leading them. And that's true of William Miller. God was using him in a remarkable way to draw the attention of the world to the soon coming of Jesus. Why do I say that? Because in those days, most Christians in America had a different view of the coming of Jesus to what all of us have here this morning. And what do I mean by that? Because most people had accepted a view in those days in America in the early 1800s that there was a millennium, 1,000 years of peace coming on the earth, and at the end of the millennium, Jesus would come. But as William Miller went back into Scripture and looked at the second coming of Jesus and the millennium, he realised that Jesus wasn't coming at the end of the 1,000 years, which meant that he was coming 1,000 years at least off into the future. He realised that the Bible taught that he would come at the beginning of that 1,000-year period, and very soon. Because in 1818 he came to the conclusion that Jesus was coming round about the year 1843-44. Well, Miller didn't want to go out and tell the world. He said he was an old man, and he'd never gone to a seminary, he'd never been trained in theology. And he said, who am I? People won't listen to me. And he argued with God for a period of over 9 years until we come to the year 1831. And here he was under deep conviction. If what you say is right, this is 1831. 1844 is just down the track a little. If you really believe Jesus is coming then, what are you doing to tell the world? And he made a bargain with God. Some of you have heard this story. He made a bargain with God one Saturday morning, August 1831. If anyone invites me to preach, and nobody had for 49 years, if anybody invites me to preach, I will go. I will go. And do you know, dear friends, within half an hour, you know, it's a dangerous thing to make a bargain with God, because God has the bad habit of keeping his side of the bargain. And within half an hour of Miller making that decision that Saturday morning, there was a knock on his door, that front door you see in that picture. And when he went to the door, he found his 16-year-old nephew, Irving Guilford, standing there saying, Father can't take the service tomorrow morning in the Baptist church in Dresden. Will you come? Will you come? Dear friends, we know what happened next, because he walked across that piece of ground, which is still there today when you visit his home, over into the maple grove that you see in the distance, and for 2 hours he wrestled with God. I took that photo of the man who played the part of William Miller in Keepers of the Flame. But he was kneeling there, right there in that little grove where William Miller had knelt back there in 1831. And somebody has said he went into the grove a farmer, because that's what he was. But he came out a preacher. He came out a preacher. Just in a year or two, the Baptist Church gave him authority to preach. And between 1832-33 and 1844, William Miller preached some 3,200 sermons in 500 towns and villages in the United States. Soon hundreds of ministers joined him. This was not just one Baptist man saying Jesus is coming in 1844. He published his lectures in 1836, and others picked up his sermons, if you like, and soon some historians say up to 2,000 ministers joined him. 2,000 ministers. Something was happening. And the interesting thing is, when William Miller first came to the conclusion that Jesus was coming after studying Daniel 8, he thought he was the only one in the world coming to that conclusion. He never realised how many more were being led by the Spirit of God to announce something. Why? Because prophecy says the book of Daniel was to be opened. The prophecy of the 2,300 years was to be preached in the time of the end. And in 1840, he continued his preaching with his chart at the back. The newspapers carried pictures of the largest tent that America had ever seen up till that time. It was called Father Miller's tent. And in that place, 4,000 people could meet in that tent. And it proved too small, and soon they had to put a splice in the centre that enabled 2,000 more people to fit into the tent. Why? Jesus was coming, my friends. Look at some of the titles of the magazines they began to publish. The Signs of the Times, The Midnight Cry, The Trumpet of Alarm, The Voice of Truth, The Voice of Elijah, and many more. In fact, a little lady, well, she was only 17 at the time in the disappointment. She later on wrote a book called The Great Controversy. But she had been a participant in that movement, and I want you to notice what she wrote. Of all the great religious movements since the days of the apostles, none have been more free from human imperfection and the wiles, the deceptions of Satan than was that of the autumn of 1844. Even now, after the lapse of many years, all who shared in that movement still feel the holy influence of that blessed work and bear witness that it was of God. Why do we look at this morning, dear friends? So very, very briefly. Because out of this movement was to arise the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But it had arisen in time, in fulfilment of Bible prophecy. And if you look at that map that I showed you, you'll notice that just below the chapel on the top left-hand corner is Ascension Rock. Let me take you to Ascension Rock, because that's a large outcrop of limestone rock just next door to William Miller's home, just beyond the grove where he agonised with God for 2 hours that morning in 1831. If you look toward the east, it has a wonderful view of the east. And on that day, October 22, which was the day they finally set, you might say, how did they do that? Let me merely tell you, they went to Scripture. They went to Scripture. They didn't pull the date out of the air, as I hear some people say. I have been impressed that those early pioneers, dear friends, were so devoted to the Bible. And they had to go to the Bible to decide what the day that they would expect Jesus to come. They found it in Leviticus, and the 10th day of the 7th Jewish month, which that year was October 22, was the date they finally set for Jesus to come. What a day, what a day. You know, dear friends, if I could prove to you this morning that Jesus was coming next Tuesday, how would you spend from today to Tuesday? I'd just like you to think about that for a moment. Because these people, and you say, well, how many people were waiting? Historians vary from 150,000, some say even 300,000 or more were waiting. You say, well, only 150,000? But if you blew that number up in proportion to the population back there, to the population of America today, more than 200 million, there would be more than 2 million people waiting for Jesus to come. This was no minor movement, dear friends. Jesus was coming, they felt sure, and they waited on that day. And any time they expected to see in the eastern sky the coming of the Lord. The coming of the Lord. But he didn't come. And we call that day, dear friends, the day of the great disappointment. I don't think any of us here in this church this morning have any idea of the intensity of the disappointment that came to them on October 22, 1844. After all, they not only expected to see Jesus coming, they expected the resurrection. They expected to see their loved ones again. Can you imagine what it would be like if you knew that Jesus was going to come next Tuesday and we would see our loved ones and we would see Jesus and there'd be no more pain and no more sorrow in the world? What a day that was black with disappointment. Black with disappointment. But my friend, before I close this morning, I want to merely refer you back to the chart. What had God prophesied? I am amazed, dear friends, and that's the only emotion I can share with you this morning, that God should have predicted 2,000 years ago in the book of Revelation that as a result of preaching from the book of Daniel as it was opened, there would be a bitter experience of disappointment. Imagine, it had already been foretold in the book of Revelation. You might say, well, when? Well, remember the text, 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. But in Revelation chapter 10, which we looked at last night, here was this mighty being, heavenly messenger, coming down with a little book open in his hand. The little book of Daniel, now open because it's the time of the end. And that out of that book, they were to proclaim a message, time no longer, no more delay. Jesus is about to come. And this was to be proclaimed when the seventh angel was about to sound his trumpet, just before Jesus comes. But then in that remarkable vision of Daniel chapter 10, dear friends, the book of Revelation, in Revelation 10, John was invited to go up and eat the little book of Daniel, eat it. What did that mean? The book of Jeremiah had written, thy words were found, and I did eat them, and they were unto me the joy and rejoicing of my heart. If I say to you, I took a book out of the library and I've devoured it this week, you know very much what I meant. A book that I read with great interest. And in John's prophecy, John is invited, eat the little book, and then there follows these remarkable words. When I ate it, it was sweet in my mouth, but after I had digested it, it became bitter. The reception of the little book of Daniel in the time of the end, when the preaching of the 2,300-year prophecy was to be preached to the world, it would produce a sweet experience initially, but it would turn to a very bitter experience. Sweet to hear, but a bitter experience. Dear friends, as I think of the experience of William Miller, I'm reminded that William Miller was right in three things that he said that I leave with you this morning. He was right in preaching the soon coming of Jesus. He was right in urging people to prepare for the coming of Jesus. And he was right in stating that the 2,300 days represented 2,300 years. Still true, my friends. The angel Gabriel gave it in the book of Daniel. You might say, well, he was wrong on a major event. He was. But God was leading through that bitter disappointment to lay the foundation for the rise of this church. On Wednesday night, dear friends, I want to talk about the great disappointment, his appointment. Can I invite you to come back on Wednesday night? Because, dear friends, when I think about the second coming of Jesus, people can say to me, Dr. Lindsay, that was 170 years ago they expected Jesus to come. But I want to remind everyone here this morning and to hearing my voice that we are 170 years nearer the coming of Jesus. And in order for the world to be warned that Jesus was coming, after that bitter disappointment, John was told, you must preach again. You've done some preaching. And the words there in Revelation 10, don't think your preaching's finished. You've now got to take a message to the whole world. And that message is the subject of our talks for the remaining part of this week. Dear friends, as I look into your faces this morning, I'm reminded that each one of us must soon see Jesus come. Now, whether you'll be alive at that time or not, that's not the big question. It's whether you're ready to meet him. Not whether you're sitting in an Adventist church on a Sabbath morning. You can be sitting in an Adventist church on a Sabbath morning and not be ready for Jesus to come. You might have your name in the church books. You've been baptised. That's not what's going to qualify you and me to be ready for Jesus to come. It's what Jesus said to the foolish virgins in Matthew 24, when he said, I don't know you. And the door was shut. And I'm reminded, therefore, dear friends, that there are going to be some people who have been waiting for Jesus to come, waiting for the bridegroom to come, just like those foolish virgins. They were all Adventists. They were all waiting for the bridegroom to come. They all had a lamp. They all had oil at the beginning. But some of them had not made the necessary preparation. And when they went up to Jesus later, you remember the parable? Jesus says, I never knew you. I never knew you. I want to ask as I close this morning with as much earnestness as I'm capable of, does Jesus really know you? And do you really know Jesus? You can know about Jesus, but not know him. I know a lot about the Queen, but I can't say I know the Queen. How is it, dear friends, with you this morning? We talk about the second coming a great deal, but what is Jesus going to say to you? I never knew you? Or are you somebody who is thoroughly delighting in the friendship that you have with Jesus that is growing day by day? Not that you're sitting in a Springwood church on a Sabbath morning, but that you are looking forward with a real relationship with Jesus because you know him and you know that he knows you. It is my prayer this morning that each of us can be sure as we leave this church today that Jesus knows us and that we know him and that our friendship is growing, because that's the ultimate question you and I have to answer. May God bless you.